Hey, I'm Jess.
And I'm Ryan. And this is Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
Today's episode's actually kind of a special one. Besides getting to have video, we also decided as a year-end special, we wanted to bring Denise in. Denise is our producer and has been listening to every single episode, doing all the amazing edits. And she often comes away with questions for us, especially because she's also a client. So you get to have client asking us any question she wants based on our last episodes. So with no further ado, let's dive in.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Denise. Yes, I edit all the episodes that you've been listening to. I mostly do the social media stuff, but Una also does a good chunk of that. So shout out to you, Una. Thank you so much for your hard work. Mm-hmm. And yes, I always make Jess and Ryan do this, but I wanted to do it myself as well this episode. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your following. Thank you for everything. Really appreciate you engaging with us. It's amazing to see how much people resonate with what we're doing here.
Yeah. All right, Denise, you've been listening to us for months now because we started this podcast probably in June when we started recording. We've been thinking about doing this for a while now.
Yeah.
And you've been with us since the beginning. Mm-hmm. What has kind of resonated with you? What do you want to ask us?
I have so many questions. So many questions. Listen, every time I'm editing, I come up with so many questions. The thing is, I'm there for every recording.
Yeah.
But even then, I'm not really listening to ask questions. I'm just listening more so for the technical stuff. When I'm editing, like so many questions come up and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I really want to ask them this. So we decided that we're going to do this episode and I'm going to ask them questions based on all the episodes that we have so far. We have 11 episodes out, but I'm going to start from the very beginning before the podcast. This is something I wanted to know for my own personal interest. And I'm sure our listeners also want to know this. How did you both meet? And mind you, I do not know the answer to this. This is the first time I'm hearing the answer to this. I insisted on having it on the podcast so I could get a live reaction.
We thought of many jokes to tell about how we met.
Yeah.
But we'll go with the true story.
Sure.
We were both students studying our doctorate in Edinburgh. Jess was a year ahead of me. Mm-hmm. And when I started my placement seeing clients, Jess had already been working at that center and was at that time they had a deputy director.
Yeah, deputy manager.
Deputy manager that had a lot of support role in like bringing on the new trainee counselors, doing the induction, which I missed and got in trouble for with the manager. And yeah, so that's kind of how we first met.
Yeah. And yeah, so it was very much in like kind of a supervisory role. But after a while, I really just started to fall in love with Ryan. They're amazing. And I am such a geek. I'm sure you can tell from the podcast. But there's a particular philosophy that I was really taken with and a couple of philosophers. And I'd asked a question in my university. And the professor kind of shut me down. He was like, no one was interested in this question. Like, only me. And there was 50 people in the class. And I raised my hand to ask this. And my friend squeezes my knee to be like, Jess, no one cares. And I look behind and everyone's just like, what?
Eyes glazed over.
Eyes glazed over. Such a very specific, very geeky question. But the professor was taken with it, so he didn't answer it in class because he realized no one's going to care. This is not relevant for anyone else but me. But then invited me to do a philosophy group, like a very small philosophy group with him and maybe anyone we wanted. So we're curating this group. Okay. And Ryan was the very first person I kind of thought of to join me in that. Okay. And that's really where we started to get to know each other. And then I brought Ryan into this other group that I had started with research called the Bodies Collective. And really from there, we just started working together a ton, writing together, presenting together. And it really morphed into this very deep friendship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really special friendship.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love witnessing you guys' friendship. Like our listeners do say they hear it. It really does reflect in how you engage with each other in every episode. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. How long ago was this, by the way?
Oh, heavens.
We figured it out.
Yeah.
Just last night or something. 2016.
Yeah.
Okay, so 8 years ago.
So 8 years ago.
I know.
Almost a decade.
We're going to do something very special for our 10-year.
Yeah, we don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the
I was
record.
about to ask.
But we're recognizing when that comes, we wanna mark the occasion.
We want to mark the
Oh, I
occasion.
love that.
Denise, are you tired of listening to us yet? I was thinking that when you said I edit every episode, I was like, oh, the poor thing.
No, oh my gosh. No, I'm not tired of listening to you guys at all. When I do get tired, it's when I'm editing like en masse. Like the last week I had to edit en masse because we're trying to get all the episodes out before the year ends and before I go home for holiday. So then I was tired, but it was less about listening to you guys and more about the work because I wanted to make sure it sounds right.
Yeah.
And make sure I cut out any like excessively in quotes long pauses and just make sure that any technical errors were not in there and they didn't make the cut. So that's when I do get tired, but actually listening I enjoy it because I do learn a lot. And this is not me saying this because you guys are my bosses. I genuinely I'm like such a nerd when it comes to therapy. Like I enjoy the psychoeducation that my therapist gives me. I love it. I geek out over that stuff. So no, I'm not tired of listening to you. I love the podcast. Yes, the episodes morph into one when I listen to them too much, but I love it.
Well, I'm honored.
I love it. But yes, on that note, since we're speaking about the podcast now, I wanted to ask you both, how do you feel about the podcast? Like how you've been portrayed, well, how you've portrayed yourselves, because I've not really done anything, to be honest. They're such naturals at this. I've barely had to produce anything because they're really, really good at knowing what to do. If you look at our scripts every week, you will be shocked. Just show someone and they were shocked because they were like, the skeletal script is what you're working with to produce such amazing content every week. But yes, how do you feel about how you've come across on the podcast so far, being so vulnerable, sharing your stories, sharing such deep parts of yourselves, knowing that you some of your clients are going to be listening?
That's such a good question. Anytime you say anything, even if you mean it a completely particular way, because you're opening it up to anybody, people can take what you're saying in a completely different direction than you intended it. And that can also happen with our personal stories. And so for me, there has been some vulnerability whiplash, like of being like, wow, I really said that. I haven't told that to really any of my clients. And now the whole world could ostensibly hear it in an episode. Yeah. At the same time, it's like, we kind of knew that we had to do that. It would have been really, like, kind of watered down if we didn't do the very things we're trying to talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I've kind of moderated my vulnerability to, make sure it stays on topic and that they're kind of like still informative and relatively generalizable kind of points that we're making. So there definitely been moments where like I could have shared more, but so we want to, at least I want to keep sharing our experiences and our thoughts without trauma dumping on a podcast. Right? That's not going to be healthy for me.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to be that helpful for listeners either, just to listen to me or both of us spiral.
Yeah.
I really love the work we do. I'm really proud of this podcast, to be quite honest. And I like just being able to dive into and talk about how therapy is done. Because that's just, I'm so passionate about thinking about that. And, I think, as I've said probably before on the podcast, like really sharing knowledge and training new therapists is what I'm most passionate about in terms of work.
I also have to thank you guys for, first of all, agreeing to do this, because when I first asked Jess, I was like, Jess, could we please do a podcast when we were speaking in, I think it was April, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, please ask Ryan, it would be fantastic. I was just so happy. I was over the moon, elated, happy, whatever other synonyms you can think of
Yeah.
when you agreed to do it, Ryan. Because I was like, ooh, I'm not sure, because I feel like they'll be a little bit more hesitant. So I just have to thank you both for agreeing to do it, first of all, and doing it as well as you do, for being so passionate about it, because it's nice to work on something that not only I'm passionate about, but the hosts are passionate about as well, and even everybody on the team, because even Una is very passionate about what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So it's really nice, and it reflects in the content, and it reflects because our listeners as well do send us feedback where they're like, oh, I really loved this episode. I really loved when Jess said this. My mom every week, she's not saying this just because she's my mom, by the way, guys.
Shout out to Denise's mom.
Shout out to Denise's mom.
Amazing.
This woman listens to every episode.
Yes,
She's incredible.
She does. But every week she's like, oh my gosh, I learned so much. Like, they should keep doing this. I really love what we're doing here. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this podcast. But yes, before we get all sentimental here, so we decided that we're going to do this based on we're going to go episode by episode. So I'm counting that as the first question for the first episode.
Okay.
We're not okay. Just asking how you guys feel about the overall vulnerability. So now on to episode 2. Can my therapist fix me?
Oh, yeah.
It's a fan favorite, that one. So you spoke about the concept of, well, listener favorite. I don't think we're big enough to say we have fans yet. But you spoke about the concept of being broken and about how a lot of us seek therapy because we're trying to fix ourselves or fix something within ourselves. So I was having a conversation with a dear loved one of mine about this episode rather in particular. And they were saying that I swear I am the exception to this whole brokenness thing, because they were saying that they feel like adulthood trauma and childhood trauma are two different things, because with childhood trauma you don't really develop into anything else. Like, you just, like, these coping mechanisms that you developed as a child, you just carry them with you. So you don't know anything else outside of that. So there's an excitement that comes with learning who you are outside of these coping mechanisms, these maladaptive coping mechanisms rather. Whereas with adulthood trauma, like trauma that happens when you're an adult, there's a very clear distinction between who you were before and who you are after. And this friend of mine was saying that they feel like for that reason they're broken, because that version of themselves that existed before is gone. Which I was saying, that's really deep.
That is.
I'm sharing this with permission, by the way. I was like, that's very deep, because when I think about it that way, it makes sense to feel like, yes, but I am broken because I wasn't like this before. I know the version of me that was thriving, that didn't have these certain traits like before as an adult. So yeah, my question here in this very long-winded thing is to say, what would you say to them? Because I honestly did not know what to say, because I was like, that makes a lot of sense. Feeling like you're the exception to the rule of not being broken is definitely something I feel like we've all felt at one point or the other.
I think when I think about this, I do have an aversion to kind of identifying as, or wanting clients to identify as, being broken. And yet we break all the time.
Yeah.
And even when we repair or heal, or, whatever terminology works for someone, there's still cracks. And those are going to be spots where we're weak, or we can maybe break along those same lines again. And I just think, like, within each of us, there are so many past selves, past versions of self. And something that I have grappled with in working with clients at times has been the desire of the client to go back to the way that things were. And no matter really when the trauma happens, you cannot go back to the way things were. Which can be really sad. There's a lot of grieving for what's lost with that. And so often when working with trauma, there's a lot of grief work to celebrate and honor what that was, and express the hurt feelings at it being lost, but then to kind of reorient to what's next. What are my new coping skills going to be? How can I celebrate and honor this version of me that's now living? And almost kind of have a farewell for that past self.
I think you said it perfectly. Oftentimes when something like that happens and we have a part of us shatter, trying to just pretend it didn't happen, going back to other ways or trying to look like things are fine is a really common tendency.
Yeah.
I often tell my clients, one of the biggest things with trauma is that we go through a lot of important hoops that we jump through in order not to feel trauma.
Yeah.
We might re-narrate the situation. We might ignore certain aspects of it. We try not to make it as scary, even though it has shattered something in us. And going through that work of actually looking at what actually happened to me. Was I actually a victim here? That language victim can be really, really hard to accept. And that is kind of part of what happens, when, especially when we're an adult or some situation happens. There's this aspect of really wanting to be more powerful than the trauma. And we're also conditioned in certain ways not to feel trauma in a socially unacceptable way. I've written about this before, but my dog, who's about to make sound and come join us, she does that. She shakes. And that shake is actually a really important trauma response because it can often allow our whole body to just get rid of that energy. We're conditioned not to. A lot of times when someone's been in an accident, for example, their bodies might do something. Why we laugh at a funeral. All of these things are our body trying to expel energy. And we often shame those responses. And so facing what's happened, allowing our body to do things that might feel not adult or not sophisticated, not poised, are actually the ways that we become bigger. And allow the trauma to make us somebody that can ostensibly be more, I'm trying to think of the right word.
Resilient, maybe?
No, more like nuanced.
Okay.
Like we're becoming so much that the trauma is not something that we ignore, but it becomes something we've dealt with, which can give us more empathy, can make us more gritty. We come out with more scars, more bruises, but at least they're not covered up wounds that we're ignoring. And all of those things, I think, is what your friend's talking about. So I don't necessarily use the term broken in the sense of maybe what they're thinking about. For me, it's when someone says they're broken, it means that they're wrong or that they're not good enough or that there's something inherently bad about them. But to have pieces that break that we then mend is exactly, I would totally agree with your friend and say that that's the process that you do as an adult, which is not for the faint of heart.
No, it does remind me of kind of the conceptualization that some people have put forward about post-traumatic growth. That also, following a traumatic experience, if you are able to do the work and have the support to address that, you often come out stronger than you were before the experience. And it even has parallels in the medical world of bones heal stronger if they heal healthy. That spot of the bone is stronger than it was before. Or even the beauty of, I can't think of the word right now, but in Japan when they mend pottery with gold, it actually becomes something more beautiful than it was.
I think you referenced that exact thing that you just said in your blog post about not being broken. I've forgotten the exact title of the blog post, but it was something about not being broken, that we can't be fixed because we're not broken. And you referenced that exact thing, the Japanese concept that Ryan just mentioned here. And the link will be in the show notes. But Ryan, I'm so glad you said that because you spoke about a sense of powerlessness in this episode, which is true in this case because there is a powerlessness that comes with realizing that this journey is lifelong. It's a lifelong journey. Healing is exhausting. We all know this. Like you just said, it's a lifelong journey, which can be exciting. And then at the same time, when you think about it, it's like, really? And I know you said you like to do looking back work, Jess, when this comes up in sessions. But I'll say I agree. But healing definitely is exhausting. And what do you say to clients when they're like, Jess, what am I doing all of this for? Like, what's the point? This is never ending. I'm always going to have to work on something. I'm always going to have to fix something. Like, yes, we can look back and say, but I've achieved this, but this lack of linearity in this process is really, really frustrating.
It's a big question. Just off the cuff, you want me to answer that? Okay. I guess that's when I do the looking back work.
Okay.
Right.
I think because if you're constantly just looking at a mountain in front of you, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
But actually, you can't really be at that spot without having climbed other major mountains before. And it just allows you to honor yourself and honor your work and take a rest. Maybe we pitch a tent for a while on this kind of crevice. Maybe we allow ourselves to just celebrate for a second. And that usually gives energy. At least in my experience, it has. Like, if you can realize some of the very things that have brought you through my door aren't even things we talk about anymore.
Yeah.
I think that gives energy.
Yeah.
So that is why I think looking back work's important. Because it allows you to kind of pause, take a breath, not have to keep thinking that that there's so much more you have to do before you're where you want to be. It's like a celebration. It's also a bit of a slowness of stopping and being and able to be proud of ourselves. That feels really important to me.
I like that you said like the pitching of the tent thing, because I feel like that's necessary. You talk about play in therapy a lot, and I love that. I actually learned that from you.
Really?
Yeah, because I never thought about it before, and then it was like, oh my gosh, that's true. Because I feel like sometimes when you're going through any healing work, you feel like you have to be serious all the time. Otherwise, you're not going to make progress as fast as you want to, or it's less meaningful if you're not serious and hard on yourself all the time. While the concept of play is very important as well, to have that exhale. I know you're not speaking about that specifically right now, but I do think it does tie into that heavily, the concept of play while you're healing.
We're very serious all the time.
No, you're not. You're definitely not.
I think one thing that in that kind of like thinking about the mountain and the journey and stuff that I'll process a little bit too with clients is that it's not about an end point. There really isn't a moment when you reach the top of the mountain and you're perfectly solved and then you transform into a therapist. That's part of the whole point of this podcast, right? Is that we're actually still on these journeys ourselves.
Yeah.
And they become about a process and a consistent practice of caring for self.
There was a line one time when I was doing my training that said, you climb up the first mountain that allows you to see all the other hills to climb and other peaks and valleys to get through. It gives you insights into where you want to go.
Yeah.
But I really like the term iterative. It's a big one, but it just means that we're constantly cycling back. So something that might have bothered me 3 months ago, I might actually come back to, but I'm a little deeper with it. And so maybe, let's say fear of missing out. I might come back to that and have a pang of people all celebrating or hanging out or bonding and I'm not there. But I might come back to it and then feel like I'm okay. Actually, tonight with this cup of tea is fine. I'm going to honor that feeling. But it's always, you're constantly coming back to things and getting deeper. So sometimes the problem with the metaphor of the mountain, as you're kind of saying, is that it feels linear. Like you're climbing upwards. But iterative is you're kind of climbing around the mountain and you're kind of getting again and again with that story to be able to really start to understand aspects of yourself that you might come back to. You might do a similar behavior, but then you're like, ooh, I haven't done that in months. What's going on for me? And you can ask that question of, I got triggered here. Okay. And I went back to a well-worn path of behavior. Let me process that. It's much more conscious.
It's one of the first kind of psychoeducation talks I often have with clients when we're setting up therapy is just to say, this is not going to be a linear experience. We're going to have a lot of ups and downs. It's going to be more of a roller coaster than a neat line on a graph. And you're not going to feel good at the end of every session. Probably not many sessions will feel happy. We're not here to have a happy chat over a cup of tea. We're here to sit in the difficult stuff.
Absolutely. And I think it all ties back to the nuance you spoke about earlier on, where you develop, where you become more stronger. Like you said, there's growth in that. I'm butchering it heavily, but you understand what I mean. I cannot say it the way you did. But on a different note, from that same episode, Jess, you said that therapists are discouraged from asking the question why, but you ask the question why. I'm curious. Why are therapists discouraged from asking that? Because that was the second time I'd ever heard that. And I was like, actually, why can't they ask why? Why can't you ask why?
I've never understood why either. I think it's because I think for therapists, they might think it's cheap in some ways. Like, instead you want to ask like kind of a question that might allow more kind of like moving forward, like how or what's going on here, let's go deeper. Why can be like putting a lot of pressure on a client. But I find if anyone's in psychodynamic therapy, they're always asking why. That's what brought them to therapy. Like, why am I doing this? Why are my relationship patterns like this? So they're already asking that question. And if I can tie it into play, I think why can be a playful question, because you're grabbing things, you're curious about it, you're putting pieces together, you're thinking like, is there something going on here that can be like unraveled, unmasked? And so I find I like that, but in our training, there's a lot of times where you're not allowed to ask the question, or it became a very like mandated thing.
It wasn't super emphasized for me on our course. It was, they didn't want us to avoid why so much. I also think there can be, one of the reasons I love the why is being in this position of power, having all this, the education that we have about how the mind works and how people think and all that. There can be this sense of like, oh, the client wouldn't get all that or something like that, which I hate. I hate that idea that the client isn't able to theorize and have those deep connections for themselves. Like, that's why we're there. Of course they can. There's a really cool psychoanalytic theorist, Carlos Padron, who talks about there's often this consideration that people with persistent mental health issues or people who are having other forms of instability in their life, like being unhoused or being impoverished, being new to a country or something, are not fit for psychoanalysis because they don't have that. And he really pushes against that and says that, like, of course everyone is able to think deeply about their life. You can still have this special hour a week or with whatever frequency works for the practice, and people can still form deep understandings of their lives. It kind of produces this chicken or an egg thing where people are like, oh, you can't have therapy until your life is relatively stable. But then you can't get your life stable because internally you're pure chaos. And I think that is one of those places where, and I won't follow this tangent too far, but that hits against what I said in a previous episode about mental health and health being a little bit different. Is there's kind of a linearity to the process of healing with physical health. You got to do the right things in the right order. And everything kind of has to happen a little bit at once with mental health.
It's not a cookie cutter kind of thing, which is
absolutely not
fascinating, but it's also irritating. It's also extremely irritating. But yeah, thank you for that. I didn't realize we were going to go that deep. I wonder if this is how it feels sometimes in your sessions where you're like, oh, okay, didn't plan for that, but this is good. So yeah, now to episode 3. Does my therapist really care about me? So a lot of you seem to want to be your therapist's favorite client, because this is another favorite amongst our listeners. So how do you deal with the emotions that come with like getting to the end of your sessions with the client, for whatever reason? Because I know for me, when I think of like whenever that time comes for me and my therapist, I get emotional just thinking about it. So I'm curious for you how that has been in the past. Because you clearly form these very deep relationships with these people. So how is that?
Like thinking about the ending of therapy or the ending of a client session?
A client's, like, not the session, but like seeing that client, like, oh, Jess, we don't need to see each other anymore because I'm moving, or whatever reason. Yeah. So how is that when you get to the end of your journey with a client?
Do you want answers? Do you want me to grab it?
I can start.
Yeah, you go for
it. So they're really special moments because there's so much to celebrate usually. Right. I like it the least when it's not really the client's decision, when the factors are financial or they're because they're moving to a place that I can't work because of regulations and stuff like that. So like those are always the times when I feel maybe most anxious about, are they going to get the services they need in their new place or with less access because of finances? And then there might be some time I do spend doing a little bit of practical planning about, like, we can find a few resources in your new location, or I can give you some referrals to lower cost services, things like that. But in terms of the emotional part of the ending, like, yes, I feel that too with clients. Very much. I try to be very intentional about taking care of my own feelings outside of the session about the ending, and then coming to the client being much more open and just kind of asking, like, is there any way you would like to mark this ending to kind of celebrate and observe that? And I'll always do some of that looking back work that we were talking about before, celebrate their successes and their progress. And then some clients I found, they just want to be done. They want to say they're done and be done, and that's fine. And there's some clients that might want to make it special somehow. Maybe we'll have a piece of cake together or something. I've had clients that we do a piece of artwork together to kind of commemorate, and so they also have something to take away. Yeah, it really varies by the client. And that can be one of the times when I really have to take care of those therapist parts of me, when a client is like, yep, thanks, this was great, bye. And I'm like, but wait, don't you want to color together?
Okay, bye.
So I try to find, ways to express my care for the client that are, within what they're needing and seeking. And then I'll take care of my own needs later. Then I'll color on my own time.
Or paint on your own time.
Or paint, whatever. Yes.
Yeah. I think it's very rare to have a client leave with an ending and not miss them. Most of my clients come at pretty specific times, really pretty regular times. It's very odd for that time to come the next week and be like, 9 a.m. on a Thursday. Okay. I usually give a thought out to those clients. The thing is, though, is that they never stop being my client in my heart.
Oh, yeah. You did say that.
Yeah. So that part feels important for me with an ending, is I will still have space for them in my office if they ever want to come back, but also in my heart. Like, if I see them on the street, I'll still treat them like I would as a therapist. And it actually can be quite special sometimes to see somebody on the street, and they might not either notice you and they're just doing their life, but sometimes actually to have that interaction of saying hi. One time I had a client, it was in a very random situation. I was wearing this baseball cap and I looked kind of funny. I was handing out posters for the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So I was helping out a friend. And a client passed. So I was in a very different position. But the client we said hi. And then I kind of had this little, And then they came back and they said, I just wanted to let you know that what we did together was actually incredibly helpful. And it was this moment of kind of the coming back to say, I wanted to say this. Yeah. It stayed with me for years. That feeling of what we do sits with somebody long after we're done the work. And I think I would say to anybody that's wondering about their therapist, we usually feel the exact same way. The work we do with you also stays with us for a while. If someone's working relationally, the relationship matters. And And the other thing I've noticed is that it won't be uncommon that if something hits a client, even 2 years later, that because of that relationship foundation we have, that they might come back. So unless something's definitively ended, I actually won't really, very rarely will I close a file if I think that someone's just having a bit of a break, because it's been pretty usual that someone will come back. But in that interim period, I definitely will miss them. Yeah, we're human too.
Yeah, I understand. As you were speaking, I was thinking of my first therapist. I was seeing her under my university. So we had a limited number of sessions, I think maybe 10 or 12. And we did a lot of work in that time. And when we got to the end of our sessions, I was like, I don't think I cried in front of her, but I was like so emotional. Like, what am I going to do? Like, I've realized now I have so much more work to do than I did at the beginning of this. And also I came to rely on our time together, not in like a codependent way, but just like knowing that, okay, this is a space that I can really let out whatever is going on in my life with no judgment. It was just such a well-cultivated space that I really, really appreciated her. And it's nice to know that she also felt that way, because she did express it in like a professional way, like, yeah, you know, I enjoy our sessions. But to hear it in a deeper way from you both, it's refreshing. It's really refreshing. All right, so now on to episode 4. Do therapists struggle with mental health issues too? So I have a bit of a hard question for you both. How do you show up on those especially hard days? I know you can take sick days, but the problem with sick days, or mental health days, as some places are calling them right now, is that they're kind of based on the medical model in the way that they're limited, which also makes sense for the society that we live in, this capitalist society, because you can't say, oh, I'm taking 6 months out to mourn a close friend of mine or whoever is passing, or this and that, or to deal with my depression or this or that. But I'm just curious as to how you show up on those days when it's especially hard and you cannot take a sick day. Because Ryan, you did mention some of the coping mechanisms that you use to take care of yourself. But like sometimes those, at least for me, when it comes to some certain coping mechanisms, I'm like, there's only so much they can do. Sometimes you just have to feel the hard feels. And I can just imagine for you in the space that you're in the position that you're in as therapists, how hard it can be to show up to work where you're carrying this much heaviness for other people. How do you navigate those days when you're especially struggling?
Plan your vacations, first of all. So the most important part of that equation for me is doing my best to stay out of really dangerous territory in terms of my mental health. Okay. Right? Having a really robust self-care practice, not waiting until I'm burned out to take a vacation, but trying to think like I've learned about myself, like I need a break every so often. They can be short breaks sometimes, like a long weekend, and sometimes I need more of a week or something like that. But interestingly, I don't know if you find this for yourself, but I find that I'm a really good therapist when I'm struggling.
Really?
I think I have this kind of rawness and availability. I typically am not as worried about not being able to be there for my clients. And if it's that severe, then it's very severe, and I have to take a day off. And usually I can in a day pull myself out of the really deep part of it. But I do find that I can be really available for clients. The cost that I pay for doing that to myself is quite high. So that's where I would recognize that I need to change something in my life or take a break if I'm having more than one of those days in a row. When I was studying and kind of first learning how to offer people that availability, I used to say to people that I feel like a piece of meat being punched by Rocky. You know, if you do the Rocky Balboa, the boxing movies, right? I know. You weren't expecting a masculine reference from me.
Oh my gosh, Ryan.
But I just felt like there's that scene when he's training and he's boxing on a big slab of meat.
That's right.
And I have had times when I just feel like I'm this piece of meat being beaten.
By your clients or by life?
By life, by the work, not really by any specific client, but it's just like I'm raw and the rawness keeps getting punched.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's really important for you to mention, Ryan, because in this episode, Jess, you shared how during the pandemic, for example, when people were coming to you about with concerns about losing their jobs and everything, you were also struggling with the very same things. So it's like life is dealing you these punches by punching you, and then it's like inadvertently you're now kind of facing those same things in therapy. So having to take care of yourself, not necessarily because of the clients, but just because you're facing the same things that people are coming to you with. So how that kind of leaves you in a tricky spot where you have to really double down on the self-care.
Absolutely. Yeah, during COVID I definitely burnt out because I think like everybody, we just I didn't know what mental health would mean to somebody if they've lost their job and couldn't afford it without insurance. So there was an uncertainty, and in the field, if you're a private practitioner, if you don't work, you don't eat, right? I didn't have a salary or anything like that. So it was tricky. I had to stop, and I had to breathe, and I had to allow myself to realize that my own panic wasn't helping anybody, most includingly myself. But when you first asked that question, Ryan, I had the exact same thought, that there's something that happens to me, and it sounds like it happens to you too, in the therapy room, where it's almost like I can just do the work, even if I'm having a day where I'm feeling depressed, or if I have a lot of things hitting. It's like I enter this space where I can just, it almost enlivens me. And I do see a lot of therapists actually as clients, and we actually bond over this, that it's very rare for me to say, should you be seeing clients now? Because I know that feeling that very often client work won't necessarily be hindered just because you're having an off day. Enter that space, you're with them, and opposite to you, sometimes I find that actually allows me to put myself away. And when I come out of sessions, I actually can feel better because I'm not cycling the drain of my own thoughts anymore. So that can be really quite helpful. But I only see 4 clients a day. I find that really important. And I find if I see more, I will wear myself out. I want the first client and the 4th client, or any client, like the first and the last, to have the exact same amount of space in my head, in my heart. And if I'm tired by the 7th client, they're not getting the kind of therapist that I want them to have. So for me, I know what my number is. My sweet spot's 4. I can do 5, but my sweet spot's 4, where I end the day and I still have a lot of energy to continue on. And that's also part of my own self-care, just knowing how to limit my day. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was very insightful. And now on to our last question for this half of the segment. So in episode 5, which is titled, What If I Trigger My Therapist? Which is also another big favorite amongst our listeners, which just goes to show their empathy.
They really have a lot of empathy.
They do.
Yeah, I was surprised how many people were taken with that, which kind of makes me think that clients must actually really worry about this. Like, is what they're giving us kind of too much? Yeah.
I think it was a very good episode, and it was nice to get that insight, because I did bring the question to you both. What I wanted to ask about this episode particularly was about transference, actually. So let's talk transference.
All right.
When you mentioned it in this episode, you mentioned that some therapists are not as well trained in holding or handling that well. So I'm curious about what the training for that looks like, for transference, around transference and counter-transference, what it looks like. Because for me, I assume that it has to do with a lot of shadow work, where the more shadow work you do, then the better you get at handling transference and counter-transference well. So yeah, what does the training look like for that?
That's a good question. A lot of trainings will have something to do with transference now. In terms of like what it is and what clients might be bringing, and counter-transference as in our stuff that we might be bringing in. But it is a psychodynamic term. And psychodynamic is all about kind of Freud and looking in into the unconscious and looking into how our behaviors now are motivated from our past, how we view others, how we relate to them, probably have some sort of link with our past. psychodynamic has changed considerably since Freud's time, but that aspect of what the past is for us and how it motivates us and how transference comes into that is all based on that modality.
Mm.
And for a psychodynamic practitioner, that does mean a lot of introspective work. You have to be able to have done your own looking at your shadow, as you mentioned, or even just thinking about how people might view you. That age-old question of like, what do you see when you see me? Mm-hmm. That feels really important for that, because sometimes we don't like how we're seen.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't do your work in processing that, it might mean that a client's bringing something that is transference that you might actually try to reject and push against. Mm-hmm. And so it is really needed for a practitioner, not just to know about the term, but to actually have done the work of thinking, how do I view others? Who might be coming in to sit with me for my own countertransference? How might clients view me? How might I want some of those and think I want to lean into that maternal transference, but maybe reject girlfriend transference or any of those others. And so for me, it's that part. Like, how do we allow ourselves to do that introspective work well?
Okay. When I think about the training that is kind of the standard training right now in North America, there's not a lot of time spent on the theory of transference and countertransference. So, having done a lot of training of new therapists, I kind of have a conceptualization that there's like 3 pillars of good training around transference and countertransference. Mm-hmm. The first pillar is that theoretical background that I'm saying a lot of programs don't do a lot of depth in. A lot of times it'll kind of be like that transference comes from Freud, and you should be aware of it and you should avoid it. It's kind of often what people are told. But then in psychodynamic, to be able to work with and be effective in working with countertransference and transference, you want to have more of that theoretical background. Understand what different people have said throughout the development of psychodynamic theory about how it works, about how it can be used to help the client, to give information to the therapist, and more fully understand our clients and their worlds. Mm-hmm. And then the second pillar is large group work, which we experienced in our training in Edinburgh, where basically you have what we call an encounter group. Ours were 30 to 40 kind of people with no agenda whatsoever, no set expectations. Usually there's some guidelines about respectful communication, and that's really about it, and confidentiality. And then you sit there in a group for 3 hours and you see what comes up. And people have pretty big experiences and reactions that might really be about their transference. It's about how people see them, how they feel about being seen that way, and so on. So you kind of get this lived experiential education in what's it like to give and receive transferences. And then there's smaller groups within that as well, where you can kind of get different perspectives about like, oh, when I saw that interaction in the large group, this is what I thought. This is what came up for me. And that can kind of help you to reorient to not only what automatically comes up for me, but what might come up for others. So you kind of get this 360 understanding of how something might be experienced. The third pillar is good supervision, where a supervisor is able to kind of help you work through, I'm having this weird feeling with this client. And then kind of help to say, like, maybe they're projecting this onto you. Maybe there's this way that you can work through that as a reparative experience. Or maybe, as Jess has pointed out before, like, maybe it's also a challenge to say, like, I don't think you're mom in this case. I actually think your girlfriend, and that's scary for you. Those are kind of that I think will give someone a good foundation to work with. There's 3 pillars to work with: countertransference and transference.
All right. The large group can kind of be a tricky one to understand, though. When Ryan and I first went into our program, we were both like, what do you mean it's 3.5 hours of unstructured time?
Exactly. Like, what do you even do for that time?
That's what every new therapist that was in our program asked. Like, what do we do? And they're like, you be.
If they would say anything. Half the time it's just,
Oh my gosh.
what's it like to feel like there's no direction?
Oh, man.
Gosh. That's scary.
It is kind of scary. But then, I think anyone listening to this, I think if I explain it this way, it'll probably make more sense. That, like, who are you in a group?
Okay.
How do you find yourself if there's, like, in a group of people? Are you the person that's wanting to kind of shine? And maybe to make it less awkward for everyone else, or maybe you're just naturally put in that position or like that position. You're the person that's kind of in the corner, that, like, happy for everyone else just to chat as long as I'm not seen. Are you the person that's an appeaser, that, like, might look at someone who's not talking to bring them in? I'm that person. It's, it's like kind of knowing that part. Are you humorous? Are you the person that might try to be a bit rebellious and ask a question no one else will go to? Or are you somebody that is fine with conflict or not? And when you start to realize that, you can start to see, how are people viewing me? And how will they view me in these different lights? How do we show up? How do we perform? So you know how I used the word shadow before? This would be persona self. How do we want to be seen in a group of people?
And does this come under the shadow?
They're kind of, what in Jung's term, like, together. Like the persona is how we want to be perceived and how we want people to see us. The shadow might be something even we don't like looking at in ourselves.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
They say that, the shadow self is the shadow cast by the persona. Persona's in the light and the shadow's on the ground.
Okay.
Yeah. So in that kind of way, if we don't have that kind of training, I really liked when you said the 3 pillars. I was like, ooh, that's very takeawayable.
That's very geeky.
I like that. If you don't have those kinds of ways of looking at it, if it's just the first pillar, just the theory, and even then you're not going to get all of the nuance of how transferences even change shape in the course of time. It used to be something we have to get rid of. We have to be neutral. We have to be a blank screen. We can't have any of our own. It's really making someone work through it. And now in psychodynamic practitioners will often use transference in a wonderful way to say, this is a microcosm of the outside world. How do we actually maybe even heal these relationships that are coming up? A lot of programs aren't really being taught that. And actually, even you and I, we'll do the first with the theory, we'll do the last with supervision, but we haven't done the third, or the middle pillar rather.
In the workshops that we do at Centered Self?
That's what I was about to say, yes.
Sorry, I took the words right out of your mouth.
Yeah, that was the end of that sentence, yes.